The scripture lesson comes from the Gospel of Mark. I will read from chapter 10, verses 46 through 52, which you can find on page 47 in the New Testament section of your pew Bibles. Listen now for the word of the Lord. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on his way. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Would you please pray with me? God, you know us completely, inside and out. You know what motivates and drives us. You know what stirs and deeply touches us. Make them the same things, O God. Let it be your word of love and mercy, word of goodness and righteousness that is written in our hearts and witnessed in our actions. Amen. Like many of you, I too am grieved by the loss of lives resulting from hate crimes yesterday. At this time, a prayer vigil right now is taking place at Ohev Shalom in Wallingford. This afternoon at 3 p.m., the Art Tolerance event at Beth Israel in Media will also offer an opportunity for peoples of all faiths to share in their sorrow and solidarity. This evening at 5 in the evening, an interfaith vigil will be held at Congregation Rodef Shalom in Philadelphia. Through these gatherings, the Interfaith Council of Southern Delaware County and the Religious Leaders Council of Greater Philadelphia hope that the coming together of different religious communities can exhibit to one another and our society a greater shared witness of peace, love, and friendship. We live in a world that is divided by race and gender, class and education, urban, suburban, and rural contexts, and politics and religion. Our world is divided not only by geopolitical and national borders imposed by powers beyond ourselves, but also by our own choices. The more choices we have, the more divided we seem to become. In our highly divided world, it's not uncommon for us to have little or no direct association with people whose life experiences and circumstances are radically different from our own. This fact does not stop us, however, from speaking about their views and values as though we know them. Our lack of direct knowledge doesn't prevent us from evaluating and judging what we think others think, believe, and feel, and want. Our opinions about what others think, believe, and value surely cover a lot more ground than our actual relationships with them do. Observing this, Nicholas Epley, professor of psychology from the University of Chicago, asks in his book, Mind-Wise, what is the best way to know the mind of others? In our consumerist culture, when marketers who want our money, politicians who want enough votes to win, and the media who want our following all seek to peg our preferences and tastes. This seems to be the million-dollar question. In these times when we are offensively bombarded by politicians and journalists, pundits, colleagues, neighbors, partners, and fellow church members who are constantly speaking as though they know not just what others think, stand for, believe, and care about, but also their motivations, Professor Epley's findings should give us pause. Each of us, he says, is such a complicated puzzle that we are actually quite blind to each other's minds. Professor Epley begins his book by telling a personal story. After piles of paperwork and months of waiting, in the spring of 2011, he and his wife finally were awarded legal custody of a young boy and girl, siblings, who are now their son and daughter. To meet them, he and his wife traveled to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. There at the adoption agency, they would also meet the children's biological father, who had traveled with the children more than half a day by foot, rusty bus, and broken down minivan from rural Ethiopia to appear in court that morning. The court required the children's biological father to confirm that he had lost his wife to disease and could no longer care for his children. In his own life, Professor Epley knew nothing about the desperation that would lead a father to give away his children. He had never experienced poverty so crushing that children would suffer from malnourishment. As he and his wife drove to the orphanage, his mind would not stop racing. What will he think of us? Will he be happy or sad to see us? Does he want to meet us, or was he forced to do so? Is he filled with regret or relief, pain or hope, or some complicated mix of all of these emotions? Is he keeping some horrible secret from us? What is it like to have decided to walk your own two children to an orphanage and then let them go? I wanted to understand, he writes, to know, to see the world through this man's eyes so that I could someday explain it to my children. But his mind was a complete mystery to me. I had no sense of what it was like to be in his shoes. Upon meeting the children's biological father, almost instantly, tears started running down the man's face. The man hugged him tightly, desperately, with both in tears for several long minutes. The man just wouldn't let go. Describing that embrace, he writes, behind that embrace was a lifetime's worth of information, of understanding into our children's pasts and his hopes for their future, of his beliefs about what was happening and his deepest feelings toward it. Behind that embrace was the mind of a man I so deeply wanted to understand, but whose mind will always remain out of reach. Professor Epley tells this story to make the point that even when we are not stretched by experiences so different, cultures so foreign, and histories so unknown, we have difficulty in seeing the world through the eyes of another. In fact, his research shows that the less we know about the mind of another, the more we use our own minds to fill in the blanks. What we think, believe, care about, and feel become the lens for knowing other people's minds. Can you imagine, then, what happens when we try to know the mind of God? Invisible, mysterious, transcendent God. A God who, in speaking with Moses, described himself as I am who I am, and yet who wants us to be in relation with God. So much so that God reveals God's self in Scripture, in creation, and in Jesus Christ, whom we call Emmanuel, God with us. How often do we and other Christians try to know the will of God? Through interpretation of Scripture, prayer, and spiritual discernment, we try to know the mind of God. The problem, of course, is that God doesn't answer opinion polls, and Scripture is open to interpretation. The less we actually know about God's mind, the more we tend to project our own onto God. In addition to an anthropocentric tendency by which human beings tend to imagine that God is like human beings, at work is an egocentric tendency by which each of us may tend to imagine that God thinks like each of us thinks. In a neuroimaging experiment in which volunteers reported their own beliefs as well as God's beliefs while lying on their backs in an MRI scanner, researchers found that they could not tell the difference in overall neural activity between people reasoning about their own beliefs and their reasoning about God's beliefs. If God is a moral compass, then the compass seems prone to pointing believers in whatever direction they are already facing. Given this, it's not surprising that when people fight religious wars over what God does or does not want, people are usually fueled by the sense of having God on their side. Even more than when they're trying to understand the mind of someone they don't know, believers in God become even more egocentric when they try to reason about what God thinks. How do we overcome this very human problem? Especially when we want to be faithful to God. If we want, like the blind man in the Bible story we read this morning, to gain sight and follow Jesus, how do we overcome the problem of not knowing the mind of Jesus, much less of God? The story from the Gospel of Mark is instructive for us. One lesson is this: you don't let other people's stereotypes serve as a lens between you and others, and certainly between you and Jesus. Stereotypes are the lens through which groups of people are seen. Through the lens of stereotypes, the qualities of individuals become nearly invisible. By thinking in terms of collective identities, by lumping individuals into groups, our minds quickly fill in the blank slate with stereotypes about a person we truly do not know. We tend to read the other person's mind on the basis of stereotypes. In the story about the blind man named Bartimaeus, we see how people in the crowd initially treated him. Sitting by the side of the road that Jesus and his disciples were taking to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem, Bartimaeus undoubtedly noticed the commotion of the crowd following Jesus. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth who was passing by, Bartimaeus began to shout out to get his attention. He wanted Jesus to notice him. The people in the crowd, so focused on Jesus, probably would not have paid any notice to Bartimaeus if he had not been yelling with such insistence. When they did notice him, they sternly ordered him to be quiet. Because of the blind beggar's social status, his disability, his hopeless situation, people in the crowd saw him through their stereotypical lens as an outcast, and they treated him as though he were a nuisance. They never imagined that Jesus would give him the time of day. And in that moment, however, Bartimaeus would not settle down. He held out hope that of all people, this one person about whom he had heard this Jesus of Nazareth would notice him, would see past any stereotype and see him for who he truly was. And thanks be to God, this is exactly what happened. Jesus stopped and said, "Call him here." The people in the crowd must have been surprised. It must have surprised them to see how Jesus related to Bartimaeus, not through their stereotypical lenses, but directly as a person about whom Jesus refused to make assumptions. Having heard Bartimaeus calling out for him, Jesus asked him, "What do you want me to do for you?" This is the same question that not long ago Jesus asked his disciples, James and John. Even though Jesus knew James and John well and had just spent time telling them what was going to happen to him in Jerusalem, it became clear to Jesus that these disciples still failed to understand the mind of Jesus. They still related to Jesus through their prior lens of political expectations and hopes. So when Jesus asked them the same direct and open-ended question that he later asked Bartimaeus, "What do you want for me to do for you?" They responded, "Grant us to sit at your right hand and at your left in your glory." As misguided as they continued to be, Jesus refrained from judging them. He knew that the time would come when each disciple would have to answer for himself the question, "Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" For us, living nearly 2,000 years after Jesus lived, it seems even harder to know the mind of Jesus. And yet here in this story, we are shown how Jesus relates to us directly, without group stereotypes of gender, class, education, race, politics, and religion getting in the way. Jesus knows each of us, what you and I think, believe, feel, and want. Without making assumptions about us, Jesus openly and directly asks the question that each of us can answer for ourselves. What do you want me to do for you? And no matter our answer, whether we follow him or not, Jesus knows his own mission, the cup from which he will drink. In the end, faithfulness will be on Jesus' God-given terms, not through the lens of people in the crowd, not through the lens of any group stereotype, not through the lens of his own religious people, not even through the lens of their long-held expectation for a political Messiah. If we want to know Jesus, Bartimaeus' answer is instructive. More than anything, Bartimaeus wants truly to see. "My teacher," he responded, "let me see again." Then Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. The best way to know the mind of another, according to Nicholas Epley, is by direct experience, or by hearing about it directly from someone who experienced it. This means that we have to let persons speak their own voice, their own mind, in the first personal pronoun. Professor Epley warns that we do not overcome the problem of mistaking other people's minds by trying harder to imagine their perspectives, because if our beliefs about the other group's perspectives are already mistaken, our effort to imagine their perspective will only magnify the inaccuracy. He warns that it takes a great deal of humility and self-control to understand others as they actually are instead of as we imagine them to be. This is what I will keep in mind as I prepare to go to Toronto next week to attend the Parliament of the World's Religions. The Parliament of the World's Religions was first convened in 1893 in Chicago at the World Columbian Exposition. At the time, it was the first formal gathering of representatives from Eastern and Western spiritual traditions and gave birth to interreligious dialogue worldwide. Since joining the Parliament's Board of Trustees a few years ago, I've learned more about the organization. Its mission is to cultivate harmony among the world's religions and spiritual communities for a just, peaceful, and sustainable world. But its approach is different. Rather than convening representatives from religious and spiritual traditions,